folks, we're back in America! Fish Lake National Forest in Utah, to be exact. And this is the pando tree. Trees? Tree? What? Pando may look like thousands of individual trees, but it's really one massive interconnected root system. The root system spreads over 106 acres and consists of more than 40,000 individual stems. Not only is pando one of the largest living organisms on planet Earth, it's also one of the oldest. It can be anywhere between 8,000 and 80,000 years old. Oh, that's amazing. And now, a cartoon. In this one, old Doc Donkey helps out an ancient termite-infested sequoia tree. Let's see what happens in The Tree Surgeon. Up next, Bucket O'Crop with Mr. Quizzer.
NetCredit is here to say yes
You believed in me.
to a personal loan or line of credit, even when other lenders won't.
When you said yes. When you said yes.
Apply online in minutes and get funds deposited the next business day or